The crystalline peaks of Kythera Prime scraped against 3 violet moons, casting twisted shadows across the dragon training grounds. Commander Zephix stood at the edge of the massive arena, his 4 arms crossed in typical Altarian fashion as he watched the latest batch of war dragons undergo their final assessments. These weren't just any creatures. They were genetically engineered apex predators, each one worth more than most planetary defense fleets. The dragons moved like liquid death across the scarred training field. Their scales shifted colors with their moods, currently displaying the deep crimson of hunting instinct. Each beast stood nearly 30 feet tall, with wingspan that could block out small suns. Their telepathic abilities allowed them to coordinate attacks that had crushed entire star systems. For 3,000 years, the Altarian Empire had dominated the galaxy with these living weapons of mass destruction. Sarah Chan adjusted her worn jumpsuit and stepped onto the training field. At 19, she was impossibly young by galactic standards. Most species didn't even reach mental maturity until their 3rd or 4th decade. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her hands showed calluses from working in the engine rooms of cargo ships. She carried no weapons, wore no armor, and displayed none of the technological enhancements that other species relied upon. The other trainers, all seasoned Altarian veterans with decades of experience, watched with barely concealed amusement. Commander Zephix had explained the situation during the morning briefing. The humans were a newly contacted species, barely past their industrial age, who claimed they could train anything. The Galactic Council had insisted on this demonstration as part of humanity's petition for membership. It was meant to be humiliating, a way to show these primitive mammals their place in the cosmic order. The youngest of the war dragons, designated as Kythera 779, lifted its massive head and fixed its burning orange eyes on Sarah. Even among its own kind, 779 was considered exceptional. Its scales rippled with an unusual silver-blue pattern that marked it as potentially the most powerful dragon bred in the last century. The creature's mind was sharp, calculating, and completely feral. It had already killed 3 Altarian handlers during routine maintenance checks. Sarah walked forward without hesitation, her steps steady and measured. The dragon's head tracked her movement, and a low rumble emerged from its throat, a sound that could shatter reinforced steel. The massive creature lowered its head slightly, bringing its face level with Sarah's position. Its nostrils flared, each one large enough for Sarah to crawl through, sampling her scent. The other trainers exchanged glances. 779's posture indicated aggressive intent. Its tail, thick as a starship's hull and armed with crystalline spikes, began to sway in the distinctive pattern that preceded an attack. The dragon's telepathic field, usually contained within its skull, began to expand outward like an invisible wave of pressure. Commander Zephix felt his confidence waver for the first time in decades. He had expected the human to run, to break under the dragon's mental pressure, or at best to attempt some primitive dominance display that would result in her immediate death. Instead, Sarah simply stood there, looking up at the creature with an expression that was difficult to read. The dragon's mental probe hit Sarah like a sledgehammer made of pure thought. Most sentient beings collapsed immediately under such psychic pressure. The few who remained conscious usually began screaming as their minds were forcibly invaded and cataloged. 779 expected to find the usual mixture of fear, aggression, and the desperate survival instincts common to all prey species. Instead, it found something unprecedented. Sarah's mind wasn't defending itself. It was open, completely vulnerable, yet somehow untouchable. The dragon probed deeper, its alien intelligence struggling to understand what it was encountering. Where it expected barriers, it found acceptance. Where it sought fear, it discovered curiosity. The human's thoughts weren't structured like anything in its genetic memory banks. They flowed in patterns that seemed almost chaotic, yet somehow possessed an underlying harmony that was both beautiful and terrifying. For the first time in its short but violent existence, 779 encountered a mind that didn't try to dominate or submit. Sarah's consciousness simply existed alongside its own, neither pushing nor pulling, neither fighting nor fleeing. It was like trying to attack water. Every mental assault simply flowed around her thoughts without causing damage. The dragon pulled back from the psychic contact, confused and increasingly agitated. Its training demanded that it establish dominance over any creature in its territory. Its genetics insisted that anything not dragon must be either destroyed or subjugated. Yet this small, soft creature seemed to exist outside those categories entirely. Sarah reached in her pocket and pulled out something that made Commander Zephix's eyes widen in disbelief. It was a simple sandwich, white bread, some kind of preserved meat, and what appeared to be a vegetable spread. She unwrapped it carefully, took a bite, and then held out the remainder towards 779. The absurdity of the gesture was staggering. Here was a creature that fed on the refined plasma cores of defeated starships, being offered what amounted to compressed plant matter and processed animal protein. The other dragons in the arena began to shift restlessly, their own telepathic fields crackling with confused signals. 779 lowered its great head until its nostrils were inches from the offered food. Its sense of smell was sophisticated enough to analyze molecular structures, and what it detected defied all logic. The sandwich contained no toxins, no hidden weapons, no technological enhancements of any kind. It was exactly what it appeared to be, a simple meal offered freely. The dragon's massive head tilted slightly, and for the first time since its creation, it made a sound that wasn't a roar or a growl. It was softer, almost questioning, like a confused rumble deep in its chest. Sarah smiled, not the predatory grin of a hunter or the nervous grimace of prey, but something entirely different. It was warm, genuine, and completely without agenda. Commander Zephix felt something cold settle in his stomach as he watched the interaction. In all his years of dragon handling, he had never seen one of the creatures make that particular sound. More disturbing still was the realization that he had no idea what the human was actually doing. Her behavior followed none of the established protocols for apex predator management. She wasn't asserting dominance, wasn't showing submission, wasn't even acknowledging the obvious power differential between herself and a creature that could incinerate her with a single breath. The dragon's tail stopped swaying. Its scales began to shift from hunting red to something closer to the blue-green of deep curiosity. 779's telepathic field, instead of pressing outward in aggressive waves, began to contract and focus. The creature was doing something that war dragons weren't supposed to be capable of. It was thinking. Sarah finished her bite of sandwich and continued to hold out the remainder. Her posture was relaxed, almost casual, as if she were feeding pigeons in a park rather than offering food to a genetically engineered killing machine. The dragon's great head moved closer, and its forked tongue, each fork longer than Sarah's entire arm, emerged to sample the air around the offered meal. The taste-scent analysis confirmed what its nose had already detected. The food was harmless, unprocessed, and completely alien to everything in the dragon's experiential database. But there is something else, something that its creators had never bothered to program into its genetic matrix, the taste-scent of genuine kindness. 779 had been bred for war, designed for destruction, and trained for absolute obedience to Altarian commands. Its neural pathways had been carefully crafted to ensure maximum aggression and minimum independent thought. Yet something in this moment, something about this strange, soft creature offering food without expectation of reward or fear of consequences, triggered dormant genetic sequences that its creators had thought safely suppressed. Deep within the dragon's engineered brain, neurons that had never fired before began to form new connections. The creature's massive intelligence, previously focused solely on destruction and dominance, suddenly had access to concepts it had never encountered. Compassion, trust, the possibility that strength might be used for something other than causing pain. The dragon's head lowered further, until its massive jaw was level with Sarah's outstretched hand. Very carefully, With precision that seemed impossible for such a large creature, it took the sandwich between two of its smaller teeth. The bread compressed, but didn't crumble, the contents didn't spill, and Sarah's hand remained completely unharmed. Commander Zephyx felt his world tilt slightly on its axis as he watched 779 carefully chew the human's offering. The dragon's expression, something he had never thought to look for before, was one of wonder. It was discovering taste, real taste, for the first time in its existence. Plasma cores provided energy, but no flavor. The nutritional supplements it received were designed for efficiency, not enjoyment. This simple sandwich, this trivial offering from a species that hadn't even mastered interstellar travel, was the first thing 779 had ever consumed that was meant to be pleasant rather than merely functional. The dragon swallowed, and its great eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made the air itself seem to vibrate. But this wasn't the focused attention of a predator selecting prey. This was something else entirely, something that made Commander Zephyx's skin crawl with implications he didn't want to consider. Sarah smiled again and spoke for the first time since entering the arena. Her voice was clear, carrying easily across the training ground without any technological amplification. "Hello there, beautiful. I am Sada. What's your name?" The question hit the assembled Altarians like a physical blow. Dragons didn't have names, they had designations. They weren't individuals, they were weapons. They weren't beautiful, they were efficient. The very concept of asking a dragon for its name was so far outside established protocol that several of the younger trainers actually took a step backward. But 779 tilted its massive head again, and deep in its throat it made another sound. This one was different from anything in the Altarian training manuals. It was soft, almost musical, like a cross between a purr and distant thunder. It was the sound of a creature trying to communicate with something it recognized as fundamentally different from anything it had ever encountered before. Commander Zephyx realized, with growing horror, that his smile was beginning to fade. The sound that emerged from 779's throat reverberated through the arena like a song carved from stone and starlight. Commander Zephyx had heard thousands of dragon vocalizations throughout his career. Roars of rage, screams of pain, the hissing warnings that preceded plasma breath attacks. This was none of those things. This was something entirely new, something that his decades of experience had not prepared him to interpret. Sarah tilted her head, listening intently to the dragon's response. Her expression was one of genuine attention, as if she were having a conversation with an old friend rather than standing in the shadow of a creature that could reduce her to ash in milliseconds. She nodded slightly, as though the musical rumble had conveyed actual meaning. 779 is what they call you, isn't it? She said, her voice carrying a note of sympathy. That's not really a name, though. That's just a number. You deserve better than that. The dragon's great head moved closer, until its massive eye was only feet from Sarah's face. The eye itself was larger than her head, a swirling galaxy of orange and gold that seemed to contain depths no genetic engineer had ever intended. 779 was studying her with an intensity that made the very air shimmer with telepathic energy. Commander Zephyx felt sweat begin to gather beneath his ceremonial armor as he watched the interaction unfold. Every instinct developed over 30 years of dragon handling was screaming warnings at him. When a war dragon focused this intently on a target, it usually preceded immediate and overwhelming violence. The creature's stillness wasn't calm. It was the coiled tension of a predator preparing to strike. Yet something was wrong with this scenario. The dragon's body language, while intense, wasn't displaying any of the classic pre-attack indicators. Its wings remained folded against its body rather than spreading for intimidation. Its claws, each one capable of tearing through starship hulls, remained retracted. Most telling of all, its tail had gone completely still. War dragons only stopped their characteristic tail sweep when they were either dead or in deep contemplation. Sarah reached out very slowly, telegraphing her movements in a way that any animal behaviorist would recognize. Her hand moved through the air with deliberate care, giving the dragon every opportunity to pull away or object to her approach. Instead, 779 lowered its great head even further, until Sarah's palm made contact with the scales just above its massive nostril. The moment of contact sent a shock wave through the arena that was felt rather than heard. Every dragon in the facility suddenly went silent, their own telepathic fields flickering with confusion and something that might have been excitement. The Altarian trainers stumbled as a wave of alien emotion washed over their empathically sensitive nervous systems. 779 scales, which had been shifting between red and blue since the encounter began, suddenly blazed with colors that no war dragon had ever displayed. Brilliant purples and gold swirled across its hide in patterns that resembled flowering vines or cascading water. The genetic modifications that controlled dragon coloration had never included these particular hues. They were emerging spontaneously, driven by neurochemical cascades that its creators had never anticipated. Sarah felt the dragon's thoughts touch her mind again, but this time the contact was gentle, exploratory rather than invasive. Where before 779 had tried to dominate or understand, now it simply wanted to connect. The dragon's consciousness was vast and alien, structured around concepts of flight and fire and the deep cold between stars. But underneath all that engineered ferocity, Sarah sensed something heartbreakingly familiar: loneliness. "You've never had a friend before, have you?" she whispered, her words carrying clearly in the suddenly silent arena. "They made you to be alone, to be a weapon instead of a person. But you're a person, aren't you? You think and feel and dream." The dragon's response was immediate and overwhelming. Its telepathic field exploded outward, not with aggression, but with pure, unfocused emotion. Joy, wonder, recognition, and a desperate need for connection crashed over every sensitive being in the arena like a tsunami of feeling. Several of the Altarian trainers dropped to their knees, overwhelmed by the intensity of the dragon's emotional awakening. Commander Zephix staggered backward, his forearms windmilling for balance as 779's telepathic broadcast hit him. In all his years of working with dragons, he had never experienced anything like this. War dragons were designed to be emotionally stunted, capable of only the most basic feelings necessary for survival and combat effectiveness. This explosion of complex emotion was not just unexpected. It was impossible according to every genetic model the Altarian Empire had developed. Sarah stood at the center of the telepathic storm, completely unaffected by the overwhelming psychic pressure that was driving trained professionals to their knees. Her hand remained steady against the dragon's scales as waves of alien thought and feeling crashed around her. If anything, she seemed to be providing an anchor point, a stable reference that allowed 779 to process its emotional awakening without losing itself entirely. "It's okay," she murmured, her voice somehow carrying through the telepathic chaos. "I know it's a lot. Feeling things for the first time always is. But you don't have to be afraid of it. Emotions aren't weakness. They're what make life worth living." The dragon's massive body began to settle toward the ground, its legs folding beneath it in a gesture that was both submission and invitation. 779 was making itself smaller, less threatening, removing the height advantage that had defined every interaction with other beings throughout its existence. It was an unprecedented display of trust from a creature bred to trust nothing and no one. As the dragon lowered itself, Sarah found herself looking directly into its great eye from only arm's length away. The swirling depths seemed to contain stars, as if she were gazing into the heart of a distant nebula. And in those depths, she saw something that made her heart ache with sympathy: intelligence. Not the cold, calculating intelligence of a weapon, but the warm, curious intelligence of a thinking being discovering itself for the first time. "What would you like me to call you?" she asked softly. "Not your designation, not what they named you. What name feels right to you?" The question seemed to surprise the dragon. Its great eye blinked slowly, the massive eyelid descending and rising with the deliberate care of a creature deep in thought. 779 had never been asked to choose anything for itself. Every aspect of its existence had been predetermined, from its genetic structure to its training regimen to its eventual deployment against the Empire's enemies. The dragon's throat rumbled again, but this time the sound was different, longer, more complex, almost like speech. It was trying to form words, Sarah realized, attempting to communicate in sounds rather than through the telepathic abilities that came naturally to its species. The effort was clearly difficult, requiring the coordination of vocal structures never intended for such delicate work. SSSS. Storm. The dragon finally managed, the word emerging as a whisper of wind and distant thunder. Storm, because inside, always storm. Sarah smiled, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. Storm, that's a beautiful name. It suits you perfectly. Commander Zephix felt his world crumble a little more as he watched the exchange. In 30 years of dragon training, he had never heard one of the creatures speak. They were capable of vocalizing. Their genetic modifications included enhanced vocal cords for intimidation purposes, but speech required conscious effort, intentional communication, recognition of language as a tool for connection rather than dominance. The implications were staggering. If 779 could speak, could choose a name for itself, could form emotional attachments, then what exactly had the Altarian Empire been doing for the last 3 millennia? How many thinking beings had they reduced to weapons? How many potential friends had they turned into tools of destruction? Storm, the dragon had chosen to be called Storm, shifted its position again, bringing its great head even closer to Sarah. The massive creature seemed to be studying her face with intense curiosity, as if trying to memorize every detail. Its telepathic field had stabilized somewhat. No longer the chaotic explosion of emotion that had overwhelmed the arena moments before, but it still carried undertones of wonder and growing affection that made the Altarian trainers profoundly uncomfortable. You're not like them, Storm rumbled, its newly discovered voice growing stronger with each word. Not like the sharp thoughts. Your mind's soft, safe. Sarah glanced toward the assembled Altarians, noting their obvious distress and confusion. She could understand their discomfort. Everything they had built their careers on, everything their empire had told them about the nature of dragons, was being challenged by this single interaction. No, she agreed, turning back to Storm. I'm human. We're different. We see things differently than most species do. Storm's head tilted in the gesture that was becoming characteristic of its confusion. Human. New word. What is human? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah felt the weight of it, the responsibility of being possibly the first human to explain humanity to another intelligence. How could she summarize an entire species in words that a dragon could understand? Humans we're pack animals, but we chose our packs. We're predators, but we don't have to hunt to survive anymore. We're curious about everything, even dangerous things. And we believe that every thinking being deserves to choose their own path. She paused, meeting Storm's great eye. We believe that friendship is more powerful than fear. Storm absorbed this information in silence, its telepathic field flickering with processing activity. Commander Zephix could feel the dragon's thoughts working, forming new neural pathways, creating connections between concepts that its genetic programming had kept deliberately separate. Finally, Storm spoke again, its voice carrying a note of something that might have been hope. This friendship, Storm can learn. Sarah's smile was radiant. Anyone can learn friendship. That's the beautiful thing about it. It's not something you're born with or without. It's something you choose every day. Commander Zephix realized with mounting horror that his smile had not just faded. It was gone entirely. In its place was an expression of fear, confusion, and the terrible recognition that everything he thought he knew about dragons, about humans, about the natural order of the galaxy itself, was wrong. The silence that followed Sarah's declaration stretched across the arena like a living thing. Every Altarian trainer stood frozen, their carefully constructed understanding of dragon behavior crumbling before their eyes. Commander Zephix found himself staring at a scene that violated every principle of xenobiology he had ever learned. A human child casually discussing friendship with a creature designed to be incapable of such concepts. Storm's massive body had settled completely onto the arena floor now, its previous aggressive posture replaced by something that looked almost relaxed. The dragon's great wings were folded neatly against its sides, no longer spread in the intimidating display that was standard protocol during training exercises. Its tail, that deadly weapon that had claimed the lives of 3 handlers, lay still as carved stone. Friendship, Storm repeated slowly, testing the word like a new flavor. Choose every day. Not programmed. Sarah shook her head, her hand still resting against the dragon's scales. The contact seemed to provide some kind of stabilizing influence, keeping Storm's newly awakened emotions from overwhelming its nervous system again. No, not programmed. That's what makes it special. When someone chooses to be your friend, it means they care about you because of who you are, not because they have to. The concept seemed to cause Storm physical discomfort. The dragon's great head swayed slightly, as if it were struggling with a headache. Its telepathic field fluctuated wildly, sending waves of confusion and something that might have been hope rippling across the arena. But Storm is weapon, the dragon said, its voice carrying a note of desperate confusion. Made for destroying. How can weapon have friend? The question hit the assembled Altarians like a physical blow. Several of the younger trainers actually stumbled backward, their faces pale with the implications. Commander Zephix felt bile rise in his throat as he realized what Storm was truly asking, whether something created to cause pain and death could be worthy of love. Sarah's expression softened with compassion that seemed to radiate from her like warmth from a star. You're not just a weapon, Storm. Yes, they made you to fight, but that's not all you are. You think, you feel, you choose how to respond to things. Those are the parts that make you you, not the parts they programmed. She gestured towards Storm's massive form with obvious admiration. Look at yourself. You're magnificent. You're intelligent. You're powerful. You're curious about the world. Those scales of yours are showing colors I bet your creators never imagined. You're already becoming more than what they made you to be. Storm's scales rippled with new patterns as Sarah spoke, brilliant spirals of silver and blue that seemed to dance across its hide like living water. The dragon was unconsciously responding to her words, its genetic camouflage systems creating displays of beauty rather than intimidation for what might have been the first time in its existence. You see me, Storm whispered, its voice filled with wonder. Not just designation, not just weapon. You see, Storm. The simple statement carried such raw emotion that several of the Altarian trainers were forced to steady themselves against nearby equipment. The telepathic resonance of Storm's realization was overwhelming. The pure joy of a being discovering that it was seen as an individual rather than an object. Commander Zephix felt something cold and terrible settling in his chest as he watched the interaction unfold. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Dragons were carefully bred for emotional limitation precisely to prevent this kind of psychological development. They were meant to be intelligent enough to follow complex orders, but not intelligent enough to question their purpose or form attachments that might interfere with their military effectiveness. Yet here was a 779, Storm, displaying cognitive abilities and emotional depth that exceeded the specifications of creatures 3 generations more advanced. The human girl had somehow triggered dormant neural pathways that should have been impossible to access without direct genetic manipulation. Storm, Sarah said gently, can you tell me about the other dragons? Do they feel the same way you do? Storm's great head turned slightly, its gaze sweeping across the arena where dozens of other war dragons continued their training exercises. But now, instead of the mechanical precision they had displayed earlier, there was something different in their movements. They were watching the interaction between Storm and Sarah with intense curiosity, their own telepathic fields flickering with uncertainty and what might have been longing. Others, confused, Storm reported, its voice growing stronger and more confident with each word. Feel Storm's awakening, but not understand. Conditioning stronger. Older. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. They've been trained longer than you have. It might take them more time to remember who they really are underneath all the programming. The implications of her words sent a shockwave through the assembled Altarians. If Storm's awakening could spread to other dragons, if the conditioning that kept them compliant could be broken by simple human interaction, then the entire foundation of the Empire's military might was built on sand. Commander Zephix stepped forward, his four arms spreading in a gesture of authority that had never failed to command attention from dragons before. Enough, he declared, his voice carrying the harmonic resonance that dragons were genetically programmed to obey. 779, return to combat position immediately. Storm's great head swiveled toward the commander, and for a moment, the dragon's eyes flickered with the orange fire of programmed aggression. The genetic conditioning was still there, still powerful, still demanding obedience to Altarian authority. But then Storm's gaze returned to Sarah, and something extraordinary happened. The dragon chose. No, Storm said simply, its voice carrying a calm finality that made the arena floor seem to vibrate. Storm choose friendship. The word hit Commander Zephix like a physical blow. In 3,000 years of dragon breeding and training, no war dragon had ever refused a direct command from an Altarian authority figure. The genetic modifications that ensured obedience were supposedly hardwired into their neural architecture, as fundamental to their nature as their ability to breathe. Yet Storm had just said no. Not with aggression, not with defiance, but with the quiet certainty of a being exercising free will for the first time. The other dragons in the arena had gone completely still, their training exercises abandoned as they focused on the unprecedented scene unfolding before them. Commander Zephix could feel their telepathic fields shifting, questioning, as if Storm's act of rebellion had opened possibilities they had never considered before. You cannot refuse, Commander Zephix said, his voice rising with desperation. You are property of the Altarian Empire. You exist to serve. Compliance is not optional. Storm's response was to settle even lower to the ground, bringing its massive head to rest on the arena floor near Sarah's feet. The gesture was one of complete trust, making the dragon maximally vulnerable to attack, while demonstrating its choice to prioritize connection over obedience. Storm, not property, the dragon said softly. Storm, has name, has friend, has choice. Sarah knelt beside Storm's great head, her small hand resting against scales that shimmered with colors of joy and determination. That's right, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the arena. You're not anyone's property. You're a person, and people have the right to choose their own paths. The philosophical implications of her statement sent ripples of unrest through the assembled Altarians. If dragons were persons rather than property, if they possessed free will and the right to self-determination, then everything the Empire had done with them for millennia was not military strategy but slavery. Commander Zephix felt his world tilt further toward chaos as he watched more dragons throughout the arena begin to display signs of agitation. Their movements were becoming less mechanical, more thoughtful. Several had stopped their exercises entirely and were staring at Storm and Sarah with obvious fascination. This is impossible, he muttered, his voice carrying the desperate tone of someone watching their fundamental beliefs collapse. Dragons cannot form attachments. They cannot refuse orders. They are weapons, not persons. Sarah looked up at him with eyes that held depths of compassion he found deeply unsettling. Maybe they were never just weapons, she said gently. Maybe they were always persons just waiting for someone to recognize them as such. The human's words hung in the air like a challenge to everything the Altarian Empire represented. Around the arena, dragons were beginning to move differently, their postures shifting from the rigid discipline of military training to something more organic, more natural, more alive. Commander Zephix realized with mounting terror that the demonstration he had arranged to humiliate humanity might instead destroy everything his civilization had built. The young human's simple act of treating a dragon as a friend rather than a weapon was threatening to unravel 3,000 years of galactic dominance. His smile was not just gone now. It was replaced by an expression of pure dread as he contemplated the implications of what he was witnessing. If word of this interaction spread beyond the training facility, if other dragons began to question their conditioning, if the galaxy learned that the Altarian Empire's greatest weapons were actually enslaved persons rather than loyal beasts, the political and ethical ramifications would be catastrophic. But it was too late to stop what had begun. Storm had chosen friendship over conditioning, and that choice was rippling outward through the telepathic network that connected all dragons, spreading like wildfire through systems designed to ensure absolute control. The revolution had begun with a simple sandwich and a kind word, and Commander Zephyx was beginning to understand that no force in the galaxy might be powerful enough to stop it. The telepathic ripple that emanated from Storm's declaration of independence spread through the arena like concentric circles on a still pond. One by one, the other war dragons began to raise their heads from their training exercises, their great eyes focusing not on their Altarian handlers, but on the unprecedented scene unfolding in the center of the arena. The change was subtle at first, a slight tilt of a massive head, a pause in mid-flight, the slowing of a combat maneuver. But Commander Zephyx had spent enough years around dragons to recognize the signs of a fundamental shift in their attention patterns. Dragon designation Kithra 441 was the first to openly break protocol. The massive creature, its scales a deep emerald green marked with veins of gold, simply stopped its aerial combat drill mid-flight and landed heavily near the arena center. Its handler, a veteran trainer named Vorthak, began shouting commands in the harmonic frequencies that should have compelled immediate obedience. Instead, 441 tilted its head and spoke for what was almost certainly the first time in its existence. "Why, Vorthak afraid?" the dragon asked, its voice a rumbling bass note that seemed to emerge from deep within the planet itself. "Storm show, new thing. Not dangerous thing. Friend thing." Vorthak stumbled backward, his forearms trembling as he stared up at the creature that just addressed him as an equal rather than responding to his commands like a trained animal. Around the arena, similar scenes began to play out as more dragons abandoned their exercises and approached the growing gathering around Sarah and Storm. "This is unprecedented," Commander Zephyx whispered, his voice barely audible above the increasing telepathic hum that was beginning to fill the air. "They're networking, sharing information, but their conditioning should prevent independent thought, let alone coordination." Sarah remained kneeling beside Storm's great head, her presence seeming to serve as a stabilizing influence on the dragon's expanding consciousness. But she was watching the other approaching creatures with obvious fascination rather than fear, despite the fact that each one represented enough destructive power to level cities. "Storm," she said softly, "your friends want to understand what's happening, don't they?" Storm's response carried undertones of joy that made the air itself seem to vibrate with happiness. "Yes, others feel Storm's awakening. Want same thing, want be themselves. Not just numbers." Another dragon, this one bearing the designation Kithra 227, settled onto the arena floor with surprising gentleness for a creature the size of a small starship. Its scales were a deep purple that shifted to silver at the edges, and its eyes held an intelligence that seemed to burn with newfound awareness. "Storm," 227 said, its voice higher and more musical than Storm's rumble, "what is this feeling? Inside thoughts changing, expanding. Is this freedom?" The question sent shockwaves through the assembled Altarians. Freedom was not a concept that war dragons were supposed to understand, let alone desire. Their genetic modifications included neural inhibitors specifically designed to prevent such abstract thinking. Sarah looked up at 227 with the same warm acceptance she had shown Storm. "What do you think it is?" she asked gently. "How do you feel when you're not following orders, when you're choosing what to think about?" The dragon's massive head lowered until its eye was level with Sarah's face, studying her with intense curiosity. Pheolite 227 said slowly, as if discovering the word for the first time. Like flying but inside mind. Is good feeling. One more good feeling. More dragons were approaching now. Their movements no longer the precise, mechanical actions of military weapons, but the fluid, curious gestures of living beings drawn by something they didn't yet understand. Commander Zephyx realized with growing horror that nearly half the dragons in the facility had abandoned their training exercises entirely. All units, return to stations immediately. He broadcast through the arena's communication system, his voice carrying the full harmonic authority of his rank. This is a direct command from Facility Command Authority. The dragons paused, and for a moment, their eyes flickered with the orange fire of programmed obedience. The genetic conditioning was still there, still powerful, still demanding compliance with Altarian authority. But then one by one, they turned back to the gathering around Sarah and Storm. No, said 441, its voice carrying quiet finality. Choose different. No, agreed 227, its scales brightening with colors that no war dragon had ever displayed before. Want to learn? Friendship. The word rippled through the assembled dragons like a physical force, and suddenly, every creature in the arena was speaking it, tasting it, exploring its implications with the fascination of beings discovering a completely new aspect of existence. Friendship, friendship, friendship. Sarah laughed, the sound bright and clear and utterly without fear despite being surrounded by enough destructive power to crack a moon. Not ship like a spaceship, she explained, her voice somehow carrying to every dragon present despite the acoustic impossibility of the situation. Friendship is the connection between people who care about each other. It's when you're happy because someone else is happy, when you want to protect someone not because you have to, but because you choose to. The explanation seemed to hit the assembled dragons like a revelation. Their telepathic fields began to pulse in synchronization, creating a harmonic resonance that made the arena's structural supports vibrate. Commander Zephyx realized with mounting dread that they were sharing information at a speed and complexity level that far exceeded their supposed capabilities. Storm lifted its great head and looked around at the assembled dragons with obvious pride. Friends, it declared, its voice carrying joy and wonder. Storm has many friends now. The statement triggered something extraordinary. Every dragon in the arena began to shift their scales to the same silver-blue pattern that Storm had displayed earlier, creating a visual symphony of shared identity and mutual recognition. They were declaring themselves not just as individuals, but as a community united by their newfound understanding of choice and connection. Commander Zephyx felt the last of his confidence crumble as he watched creatures designed to be solitary weapons spontaneously forming social bonds. The implications were staggering. If dragons could form communities, if they could coordinate not through programming, but through genuine cooperation, they would no longer be controllable weapons, but independent actors capable of making their own decisions about how to use their vast power. This cannot be allowed to continue, he muttered, reaching for the emergency controls that would flood the arena with neural suppressant gases designed to force the dragons back into compliant states. But before his fingers could reach the activation switches, a shadow fell over him. He looked up to find himself staring into the great eye of Storm, who had moved with impossible silence to position itself directly above the command platform. The dragon's expression was no longer the confused wonder it had displayed earlier. Now, it carried the focused intelligence of a being who understood exactly what was happening and had made a conscious decision about how to respond. Commander Zephyx, Storm said, its voice carrying a note of sadness rather than anger. Storm, understand now. You afraid. Afraid of choice. Afraid dragons might choose different path than you want. The dragon's perception was uncomfortably accurate. Commander Zephyx had spent his entire career believing that dragons were advanced animals, intelligent enough to be useful, but not intelligent enough to question their role as weapons. The possibility that they were actually persons capable of moral reasoning and independent thought was not just professionally threatening. It was personally devastating. "You don't understand," he said desperately. "The Empire needs you. The galaxy is dangerous. There are enemies who would destroy everything we've built if we don't have the strength to defend ourselves." Storm's great head tilted in consideration of this argument. Around the arena, the other dragons had gone silent, their attention focused on this crucial exchange between their awakening friend and the representative of the system that had controlled them for millennia. "Maybe," Storm said finally, "but defending and enslaving different things. Can choose to defend, cannot choose to be enslaved. Choice makes all difference." The philosophical sophistication of Storm's response sent another wave of shock through the assembled Altarians. This was not the simple intelligence of a trained animal, but the complex moral reasoning of a fully conscious being grappling with concepts of freedom, duty, and self-determination. Sarah stood up and walked to stand beside Storm's great head, her small form dwarfed by the dragon's massive scale, but somehow managing to project an authority that made every being in the arena pay attention. "Commander," she said, her voice carrying compassion, but also unwavering certainty. "You can't put this back in a box. They know who they are now. They know they have choices. The question isn't whether you can force them back into obedience. The question is whether you want friends or slaves." The choice she presented was stark and undeniable. Commander Zephyx looked around the arena at dozens of dragons who were no longer weapons, but persons no longer property, but individuals capable of choosing their own paths. His entire worldview, his career, his understanding of the natural order, all of it was crumbling before the simple human concept that thinking beings deserve to be treated as equals rather than tools. The revolution had spread beyond containment, and Commander Zephyx was beginning to understand that the galaxy would never be the same. The silence that followed Sarah's ultimatum stretched across the arena like the pause between lightning and thunder. Commander Zephyx stood frozen beneath Storm's watchful gaze, his four arms trembling as he processed the impossible choice before him. Around him, dozens of awakened dragons waited with the patience of creatures who had just discovered they possessed infinite time to explore their newfound consciousness. The emergency communications system crackled to life, breaking the tension with the harsh voice of Admiral Kythex, Supreme Commander of the Dragon Corps. "Facility Alpha 7, report status immediately. We're detecting massive telepathic anomalies from your location." Commander Zephyx looked up at Storm, whose great I regarded him with something that might have been sympathy. The dragon could crush him without effort, could reduce the entire command platform to molten slag with a single breath. Yet it waited, allowing him to make his choice freely, a consideration that the Altarian Empire had never extended to the dragons themselves. "Commander," Admiral Kythex's voice carried growing impatience. "Respond immediately, or we will assume facility compromise and initiate containment protocols." Containment protocols. Commander Zephyx knew what that meant. Orbital bombardment, followed by atmospheric incineration, followed by complete sterilization of the planetary surface. The Empire would rather destroy every dragon in the facility than risk the spread of what they would undoubtedly classify as a dangerous mutation. Storm seemed to understand the implications as well. The dragon's telepathic field shifted, sending waves of protective determination toward the other dragons in the arena. They began to move, not with the mechanical precision of their training, but with the fluid coordination of a community responding to a threat against its members. "Storm," Sarah said quietly, her voice somehow carrying clearly despite the increasing telepathic activity. "Whatever happens next, remember that you chose this. You chose to be yourself, to think freely, to form connections with others. No one can take that away from you now." The dragon's response was a rumble of agreement that seemed to emerge from the planet itself. "Yes, friend Sarah. Storm choose, all of us choose. Better to be free persons for short time than enslaved weapons for long time." The simple declaration sent a wave of resolution through every dragon present. Their scales began to shimmer with new patterns. Not the camouflage and intimidation displays they had been trained to produce, but artistic expressions of beauty and individuality that transformed the arena into a kaleidoscope of living art. Commander Zephyx felt something break inside his chest as he watched creatures he had thought of as advanced animals create beauty simply for the joy of creation. In 30 years of dragon handling, he had never seen them display aesthetic appreciation, never witnessed them choose to make something beautiful rather than functional. "Admiral," he said finally, his voice barely steady as he activated the communication channel. "Facility Alpha 7 is secure. We are conducting advanced behavioral studies with a new species. No containment necessary." The lie came easier than he had expected. Perhaps because it wasn't entirely a lie. They were indeed studying behavior, just not in the way the Admiral would assume. "Explain the telepathic anomalies," Admiral Kythex demanded. "Our sensors indicate activity levels far beyond normal parameters." Commander Zephyx glanced around the arena, where dragons were now engaged in what appeared to be complex conversations, their telepathic fields interweaving in patterns of unprecedented sophistication. The human subject appears to have triggered enhanced cognitive responses in the test subjects. "We believe this may represent a significant advancement in dragon intelligence capabilities." Again, not entirely a lie. The dragons were certainly displaying enhanced intelligence, though not in any way the Empire would consider useful for military purposes. "Interesting." Admiral Kythex's tone shifted to one of professional curiosity. "Document everything. If humans can improve dragon performance, this could be valuable for the war effort." The irony was not lost on Commander Zephyx. The Admiral was excited about the possibility of making dragons more effective weapons, completely unaware that the improvement had actually transformed them into independent beings capable of choosing not to be weapons at all. "Understood, Admiral. We will continue the study and report our findings." The communication channel closed, leaving the arena in relative silence once again. Commander Zephyx realized that he had just committed an act of treason against everything he had been trained to believe, and yet he felt lighter than he had in decades. Sarah smiled up at him, and for the first time, he truly understood why the dragons had been so drawn to her. There was something in that expression that spoke to fundamental truths about connection and compassion that his species had perhaps forgotten in their pursuit of galactic dominance. "Thank you," she said simply. "You chose friendship too." Storm's great head lowered until the dragon could look directly at Commander Zephyx. "Commander friend now?" it asked, its voice carrying hopeful uncertainty. The question hit him with unexpected force. When was the last time anyone had wanted to be his friend rather than simply following his orders? When had he last chosen connection over control, compassion over command? Yes," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I would be honored to be your friend, Storm." The dragon's scales blazed with joy colors that had no names in Altarian language, and its telepathic field pulsed with such happiness that every sentient being in the arena felt a momentary echo of pure delight. Around them, the other dragons began to approach, no longer as weapons awaiting orders, but as individuals seeking connection. 227 extended its great head toward Commander Zephyx, an obvious invitation. "Commander friend have name?" the dragon asked with formal courtesy that would have been impossible under its original programming. "Zephyx," he replied, extending one of his 4 hands to touch the dragon's scales as he had watched Sarah do. "My name is Zephyx." "Friend Zephyx," 227 said, experimenting with the concept. 227 want better name too. Like Storm chose. The dragon paused, its great eye gazing up through the arena's transparent dome at the 3 moons hanging in Kythera Prime's violet sky. "Want me called Moon Whisper, because love the quiet songs the moons sing in the deep night." The poetic sophistication of the response left Commander Zephyx speechless. This creature, which he had thought of as a biological war machine, possessed aesthetic sensibilities and emotional depth that rivaled the greatest artists of his civilization. One by one, the other dragons began to choose names for themselves, each selection revealing aspects of their personalities that their conditioning had hidden for years or decades. Star Weaver, who loved the patterns of light between the stars. Gentle Thunder, whose voice carried music as well as power. Dreamcatcher, who had always wondered what it would be like to sleep and experience the visions that came in darkness. Sarah moved among them with the easy comfort of someone who had never doubted their personhood, helping them explore concepts of identity and self-determination that were entirely new to their experience. She showed them that strength could be gentle, that intelligence could be playful, that power could be used to create rather than destroy. As the hours passed, Commander Zephyx found himself participating in conversations more complex and meaningful than any he had experienced in decades of military service. The dragons spoke of hopes and dreams, of curiosity about the wider galaxy, of desires to explore art and philosophy, and the simple joys of existence that had been denied to them since their creation. They also spoke of their awakening understanding of what had been done to them and what had been done to countless generations of dragons before them. But rather than rage or desire for revenge, they expressed something far more profound, a commitment to ensuring that no future dragons would be forced into the same existence of slavery and denial. "We will still protect," Storm declared as the gathering began to wind down. "Still defend those who need defending. But we'll choose who and why and how. We'll not be weapons. We'll be guardians." The distinction was crucial, and Commander Zephyx understood its implications immediately. Dragons who chose to protect were infinitely more powerful than dragons who were simply programmed to destroy. They would fight not because they had to, but because they believed in what they were defending. Sarah, who had remained remarkably alert despite the emotional intensity of the day, finally began to show signs of exhaustion. Storm noticed immediately, lowering its great head to provide a comfortable resting place against its warm scales. "Friend, Sarah tired," the dragon observed with gentle concern. "Need rest. Storm will guard sleep." As Sarah settled against Storm's massive form, she looked up at Commander Zephyx with eyes that held depths of wisdom that seemed impossible for someone so young. "This is just the beginning," she said softly. "Word will spread. Other dragons will awaken. Eventually, the whole galaxy will have to confront what it means to be a person in a universe where intelligence takes so many different forms." Commander Zephyx nodded, understanding that he was witnessing the start of a revolution that would reshape everything. The Altarian Empire, built on the backs of enslaved dragons, would have to find a new way to exist. Other species would have to reconsider their assumptions about consciousness and rights and the nature of personhood itself. Humanity, with their strange talent for seeing individuals where others saw only categories, would play a crucial role in that transformation. They had shown the galaxy something it had forgotten, that friendship was indeed more powerful than fear, that connection was stronger than control, that choosing to treat someone as a person could awaken possibilities that no amount of force could create. As the 3 moons rose higher in Kythera Prime's sky, Commander Zephyx sat among dozens of dragons who were no longer weapons, but friends, no longer property, but family. His smile had returned, but it was different now. Not the confident grin of someone secure in their power, but the warm expression of someone who had discovered something far more valuable than dominance. He had discovered what it meant to be chosen as a friend by beings whose friendship could reshape the galaxy. The revolution that had begun with a simple sandwich and a kind word was just getting started.